When I opened the letter my mother left behind, I never imagined it would destroy everything my family built, or give me the power to rebuild it on my own terms. My name is Margaret Blackwood, and this is the story of how I inherited not just a fortune, but a legacy poisoned by greed, and how I turned it into justice. Watch till the end, because the twist is the one even my father never saw coming. When the courier placed the old envelope on my doorstep, I almost didn't open it. The return address was unfamiliar, the paper yellowed, the handwriting elegant but trembling. It had been 30 years since my mother died, and in all that time, no one had mentioned she'd left anything behind. Inside was a letter. My hands shook as I unfolded it. The ink was faded, but her words were still sharp, deliberate. She wrote of the company she'd helped build, Blackwood Enterprises, of the husband she loved but no longer trusted, and of the daughter she believed would one day set things right. I read it twice before realizing what it meant. My mother had secretly purchased company shares in her own name, shares my father had never known about. Upon her death, they had quietly transferred to me, buried under legal layers so deep that no one had noticed. Until now. 3 days later I stood before the glass monolith of Blackwood Tower in downtown Boston. My reflection looked back at me, refined, composed, but trembling beneath the surface. I was a literature professor, not a corporate strategist. My world was built on words, not profit margins. Yet here I was, about to walk into the empire my father had built and possibly destroy it. Inside, the lobby gleamed with marble and ego. The receptionist's polite smile faltered when she realized who I was. "Mums Blackwood? Margaret Blackwood?" "Yes," I said. "I'm here for the board meeting." Whispers followed me down the hall. I could feel the tension thickening around me like fog. The company was already under investigation for bribery and fraud. My father, Walter Blackwood, was still CEO, though rumors swirled of pending indictments. My siblings, Alexander and Victoria, both held senior roles, equally complicit, I suspected. When I entered the boardroom, the conversation stopped dead. My father sat at the head of the table, silver-haired, still commanding, but his eyes, cold steel, widened slightly when he saw me. "Margaret," he said at last, "this is unexpected." "I imagine so," I replied, sliding the envelope across the table. "Mother left me something you forgot to mention." He read the legal notice and blanched. Around the room, the directors murmured. My ownership was legitimate, enough to claim a controlling interest if I chose to. "This is a private family matter," he said tightly. "No," I said. "This is a matter of accountability. The family may have built this company, but it belongs to more than us now, to its employees, its investors, and the city it serves." Victoria rolled her eyes. "You're a professor, not a businesswoman. What could you possibly know about corporate ethics?" I looked her straight in the eye. "Enough to recognize when they're missing." By the end of that day, I was appointed interim chair of an ethics oversight committee, at least in name. In truth, it was a formality meant to placate public outrage. But I had other plans. That evening, as reporters gathered outside the building, I stepped to the podium. Cameras flashed like lightning. My statement was short, measured, deliberate. "Blackwood Enterprises has failed the public trust," I began. "That failure cannot be explained away or minimized. My father, Walter Blackwood, has resigned as CEO effective immediately. I will serve as interim chair while we cooperate fully with investigators and rebuild this company from the ground up." The room exploded with questions. I raised a hand. "I joined this company 3 days ago after discovering my mother's hidden shares," I said. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to ensure that what's worth saving is saved, and what needs changing is changed." And my father's face was stone unreadable. But in that silence, I knew I'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Later, in the green room, he appeared at the doorway. "You didn't throw us to the wolves," he said quietly. "That was never my intention." "Then why this?" "Because you've forgotten what this company was supposed to be. And because despite everything, you're still my father." He hesitated, eyes searching mine. For the first time in years, I saw something behind that hardened gaze, a flicker of regret. "Be careful, Margaret," he said finally. "When you start digging for the truth, you might not like what you find." "I've lived long enough surrounded by lies," I said. "I can handle the truth." That night, I walked through the dim corridors of Blackwood Tower alone. The city lights shimmered outside like distant fires. My mother's words echoed in my head. "Power reveals character, Margaret. Use it to build, not destroy." I didn't yet know that by dawn, my decision would ignite a storm that would test every belief I'd ever held about justice, forgiveness, and blood, and that the man I was trying to save, my father, would become both my greatest ally and my final adversary. The next morning, Boston's skyline glowed pale gold over the Charles River, but I barely noticed. I sat in my office on the 32nd floor, staring at a mountain of files that told stories darker than any novel I'd ever taught. Each page was a confession. Fraudulent contracts, offshore accounts, silent payouts. My family's empire wasn't built on legacy, it was built on deceit. Every discovery cut deeper. My brother Alexander had funneled millions through shell charities. Victoria had manipulated medical research grants for personal gain. And my father, his signature was everywhere, approving it all. The air in the room felt heavy. For a moment, I wanted to walk away to let it all collapse. But then I remembered my mother's trembling handwriting. Do what I couldn't, Margaret. Make it right. At 10 sharp, Alexander breezed into my office. Tall, charming, with that perfect politician's smile. Sister, he said smoothly, I assume you're planning to resign once the dust settles. Why would I asked, not looking up. Because this isn't your world. You're a poet with a conscience, and this place. He spread his hands toward the windows. Runs on ambition. If you think you can change it, you're dreaming. I slid a document across the desk. Then wake up. You'll want to see this? He glanced at the paper and froze. It was an audit trail linking his charitable foundation to a government official's offshore account. You have no proof, he said, too quickly. Not yet, but the SEC will. His charm evaporated. You think you're better than us? No, I said softly. Just less afraid. When he stormed out, I felt no triumph, only an ache that came from watching my family unravel thread by thread. Later that day, I found my father waiting in the conference room. He looked smaller than I remembered, like the weight of his own empire was finally crushing him. You've made enemies, he said without preamble. Victoria's furious, and Alex is plotting to remove you. The board's divided. Then let them be divided, I replied. Transparency isn't a popularity contest. He studied me for a long moment. You sound like your mother. I'll take that as a compliment. She was idealistic, he said quietly, and that's what destroyed her. I leaned forward. What really destroyed her, father? For the first time, his eyes softened. You don't want to know. But I did, desperately. That night, I went through my mother's old storage boxes. Among yellowed photographs and brittle letters, I found a hidden folder wrapped in silk. Inside were legal memos dated 25 years ago, documents detailing a whistleblower case that was never filed. The name on them chilled me. Eleanor Whitmore, my mother's closest friend, a senior accountant at Blackwood Enterprises. According to the letters, Eleanor had discovered financial crimes that could have ended the company. Before she could go public, she died in what the papers called a tragic car accident. But in my mother's handwriting at the bottom of the final page were 3 words. It wasn't accidental. My heart pounded. If my mother had known that someone inside the company killed Eleanor to keep her quiet, that explained everything. The secret shares, the letter, the buried legacy. I called an old friend, Ethan Raid, an investigative journalist who owed me a favor. Margaret Blackwood, he said, his voice laced with disbelief. Haven't heard that name in years. What's this about? I think my family covered up a murder, I said. And I think it's connected to the company. He exhaled slowly. You're serious? Deadly. Send me what you have, he said. But be careful. If this is real, people will do anything to keep it buried. By the time I hung up, my reflection in the window looked like a stranger, someone older, harder haunted. The next morning, Victoria arrived at my house unannounced. She wore her power suit like armor, but her voice trembled when she spoke. You're going to ruin us, Margaret. Whatever you think you're doing, it's not justice. It's revenge. Maybe it's both, I said quietly. She looked at me with something almost like pity. You really don't understand, do you? None of this was Father's idea, I frowned. What are you talking about? She hesitated, then whispered. It was Alexander. He's the one who orchestrated everything, the fake accounts, the payoffs, even Eleanor Whitmore's silence. I felt the blood drain from my face. You're lying. I wish I were. She handed me a USB drive. Proof. But if he finds out I gave it to you, he'll destroy me too. When she left, I locked the door and loaded the files. What I saw made me sick. Emails, contracts, bank transfers, all signed and approved by Alexander. And among them, one message that shattered me completely. It was from my father, dated 2 days before Eleanor's death. "Handle it quietly. We can't afford exposure." My chest tightened. So he had known. Maybe he hadn't ordered the death, but he hadn't stopped it either. That night, I sat in the dark, listening to the city hum outside, and made my decision. If they'd buried the truth once, I would dig it up myself, even if it meant burning down everything that carried my name. The files on my laptop blurred as I scrolled. Numbers, dates, names looping into a pattern I had suspected but hadn't been brave enough to name. Alexander's signature sat across every corrupt transaction like a seal. My father's initials appeared too, faint but present, as if someone had traced over a guilty conscience. Victoria's USB had been a key. Now I had a lock to turn. I called Thomas Edwards first. He was the last person to have helped my mother when she still trusted the world to be fair, and he had kept his legal hand steady through decades of quiet loyalty. When he answered, his voice was gravel and care. "Margaret, bring whatever you have on Eleanor Whitmore and the old audits," I said. "Now, Margaret, are you sure?" "Thomas, listen, if you ever cared about my mother's name, we can't wait." There was a pause, then an exhale. "I'll be there in 20. I paced my small kitchen until he arrived, the USB drive burning a literal heat in my pocket as if it contained a small, dangerous sun. When he set his briefcase down and opened it, the air in the room shifted. Professional distance slid into determined complicity. He took the files with hands that had held more than their share of other people's grief. "This is serious," he murmured after a cursory glance. "You understand that, don't you?" "I understand enough," I said. "I understand that someone died because they knew too much." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You also understand the legal peril. You're walking into a minefield." "I also understand that if we don't dig, someone else will, and they won't be kind about it." We made a plan that night that felt more like assembling a small army than a legal strategy. Thomas would handle the secure transfers of evidence, copies to whistleblower-friendly journalists, sealed submissions to the prosecutor, and a confidential backup to a lawyer in another state. I would confront Alexander with the evidence and watch his reaction. It was naive, perhaps, to think a single confrontation could undo a lifetime of secrecy. But I was no longer naive. I was furious. I was careful. I was my mother's daughter. The confrontation needed a setting where Alexander couldn't easily hide behind charm. His townhouse in Beacon Hill was less fortress and more trophy display. He opened the door in designer slippers, a glass of something amber in his hand and an expression that tried to say casual superiority. He barely managed it. "Margaret," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I stepped inside and let the door close with a tone that sounded like a verdict. I laid the USB on his marble table without preamble. "You should be careful who you cheat," I said, "because sometimes the people you cheat are the ones who still have the courage to expose you." He laughed. Sharp, brittle. "Is this a joke? What is this? A prank?" "No." I pushed the laptop toward him and opened it to the email chain where he had discussed kickbacks with an official named Prescott. His face changed so quickly I almost missed it, from disbelief to anger to a flare of panic I'd never seen in him. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "From the person who couldn't afford to be silent," I said, "and from your sister when she realized being your accomplice wasn't worth her soul." Alexander's hand trembled, just slightly, as he reached out. "You think you can just walk in here and accuse me? Do you know what you're doing to our family?" "I know what you did to other people," I answered. "You took livelihoods, safety, trust. You falsified inspections, padded contracts, used shell organizations to funnel money. You didn't just hurt institutions, you hurt real people." He laughed again, slower this time. "You always were dramatic, Margaret. You want to be a hero because you feel small in the shadow of our name. You want to be a king in a kingdom built on bones." I said, "There's a difference." He lunged for the laptop, but I had anticipated that and shut it closed. "If you turn this over to the prosecutors, you'll ruin us all," he hissed. "You'll ruin Dad." "I might ruin him," I said, "but I will not let him, or you, ruin innocent people." For a moment I thought he might strike me. Instead he looked suddenly, horribly vulnerable, the man who had made his life out of bluster and bought loyalties. You don't understand consequences, he whispered. You don't know what they'll do. Then tell me, I said, voice low. Who killed Eleanor Whitmore? He froze. The question landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. Alcohol flashed bright at the edges of his eyes. You should leave, he said finally, before you push too hard. I'm past leaving. He moved toward a drawer and returned with a small pistol. It was ridiculous, showy, something he'd bought to look dangerous in his friend's eyes. He set it on the table between us like a prop. I understood, with a cold certainty, how far he would go to preserve what he believed was his right. Turn around and walk out, he said softly. Take whatever you want, but don't light a match you can't control. I don't light matches, I replied. I expose fire. He snatched the USB and the laptop and slammed them into a satchel. You will regret this, he said, and for the first time he sounded like a frightened animal. He left the pistol on the table and walked past me without touching me, his breath hot with anger. When the door shut, I didn't breathe until the hallways had swallowed his footsteps. Then I called Thomas. He answered on the second ring, calmer than I felt. Did it go as expected, he asked. No, I said honestly. It went worse. He knows. He's dangerous. Thomas's voice grew more focused. Good. That means he'll make mistakes, let him. But Margaret, be in the open. Let the witnesses see any confrontation. I'm not a martyr, I said. I'm a witness. We moved quickly after that. Thomas filed the evidence with the prosecutor under seal and leaked select, verifiable pieces to Ethan Reid, the journalist, who began a quiet drumbeat of inquiries designed to unsettle without revealing sources. The newspapers smelled blood and circled. Alexander's temper became public. An expensive man seen arguing in restaurants, hitting his phone, snapping at staff. The board felt the tremors and began to choose sides. But for every legal maneuver there were personal costs. Victoria, who had given me the USB and then withdrawn into a brittle truce with herself, called one night and pleaded. Alex found out you had the files, she said, voice ragged. He thinks you planted them to ruin him. He's hired private security. He's paranoid, and he's dangerous. Then we'll make him paranoid in useful ways, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We'll take his leverage away piece by piece. How? She asked. He's got the donors, the clients. He's the one they listen to. We expose him, I replied simply. We show the pattern. We make the board, the city, the regulators see it. And the family, she whispered. Do you think Dad will ever forgive you? I don't know, I answered. I didn't do this for forgiveness. That week felt like walking on ice. One misstep and we all could plunge into ruin. Alexander had started legal maneuvers to discredit the documents, hired high-powered defense attorneys, and whispered to board members that I was a vengeful interloper who wanted to usurp a legacy that wasn't hers. The city council called for hearings. Employees filed anonymous complaints. The media smelled theatrics and fed on them. Then came the call that made my chest seize. The prosecutor wanted to meet, not as a witness, but as someone who had provided evidence. We sat in a sterile conference room with a woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Lyle, who looked younger than I expected and colder than I could have measured. She slid a thin stack of subpoenas and indictments across the table. We have what we need, she said. But we need cooperation, names, dates, email access. And we need immunity for your sister and possibly others if their testimony helps us build a case. You want Victoria to turn on Alexander? Thomas asked. We want the truth, Lyle said. And we want it in a way that ensures prosecution. Victoria's cooperation would seal it, but asking someone to betray the sibling who'd once been their ally felt like asking a mother to choose which child to save. I thought of Eleanor Whitmore, silenced for knowing too much. I thought of my mother's careful investments made to give me a chance to do the right thing. The moral calculus felt impossible and necessary all at once. That night, as snow began to fall in thin strokes against the city, I found Victoria at the small table in my kitchen. She had dark circles under her eyes and a listless expression that made her look, for the first time in years, genuinely human rather than a collection of designer labels. They want you to testify, she whispered. They want me to testify. We can protect you, I said. Immunity, witness protection if need be. We'll make sure you're safe. And Alex, she asked. Do you think he'll go quietly? No, I said. He won't. But he will falter when he realizes that the people he relied on, his donors, his political friends, are distancing themselves. She looked at me as if seeing a horizon. "Then tell me what to do," she said finally. "If this is the only way to make things right, I'll do it." It felt like stepping off a cliff, but perhaps that was what my mother had intended when she tucked those shares away in secrecy, to give someone with the courage to do what she could not. The next morning, I walked into the prosecutor's office with Victoria beside me, her fingers entwined with mine in a small, fierce clasp. We were no longer only family members, we were instruments of a longer truth, one that reached beyond personal loyalty into the civic realm. As Assistant U.S. Attorney Lyle began to outline the case, I felt the true weight of what we had started. This was not about vengeance for slights or small cruelties. This was about dismantling a system that allowed greed to hide behind family names. It was about giving voices back to the ones who had been silenced. The morning after my meeting with the mayor, Boston looked softer, almost forgiving. Frost blurred the edges of the skyline, the harbor glinting like hammered silver. From my office window, I watched workers hurrying along Atlantic Avenue and thought of everything hanging by a thread: jobs, reputations, my own sense of right and wrong. Thomas arrived first, coat dusted with snow. "They signed off," he said, breath fogging. "The city agreed to continue the harborfront project under your new oversight plan." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Against every prediction, the plan had worked. The independent ethics committee, full financial transparency, and that $10 million community fund. It had convinced the city we were worth salvaging. "Then we start rebuilding," I whispered. But rebuilding meant more than budgets and contracts. It meant repairing people. That afternoon, Victoria appeared at my doorway. Her flawless posture and diamond earrings were back, but her eyes— my God, her eyes were tired. "Alexander says you saved the project," she began. "You saved it," I corrected gently. "The company survives because we stopped pretending everything was fine." She looked away, arms crossed. "I've decided to cooperate with the prosecutors. I've already called my lawyers." I blinked. "That's brave." "I'm not doing it to be noble," she said, voice low. "It's pragmatic. They already have evidence. Fighting only drags this out. Pragmatism can still be honorable." Her gaze sharpened, searching my face. "You're not what I expected, Margaret. You could have destroyed us. Instead, you're rebuilding." "That was always Mother's plan," I said. "I'm just finishing what she started." The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. Every day brought new revelations: falsified safety inspections, shell companies' political payoffs. We turned everything over to investigators. The press called it the Blackwood Purge. And yet, somewhere in that chaos, order began to emerge. We hired a compliance officer with a spotless reputation, restructured every department, and launched mandatory ethics workshops, something no one in the company had ever imagined before. Alexander worked late nights beside me, hollow-eyed but determined. His technical expertise became vital. One evening, while we reviewed environmental audits, he murmured, "I should have stopped this years ago." "You're stopping it now." I told him. "That matters." Meanwhile, Father stayed in the background, too infamous for public appearances but too knowledgeable to ignore. Every morning I found handwritten notes on my desk. Names, warnings, small insights that only he would know. His penmanship was still steady, his mind still sharp. When I thanked him once, he only muttered, "Don't thank me until we survive the next quarter." We barely did. Several executives resigned. One investor threatened to pull funding altogether. But after a tense meeting in which I refused to compromise our reforms, he leaned forward and said, "For the first time, I believe this company might actually deserve to exist." It was the strangest compliment I'd ever received. Then came the call from the university. My old life. The dean's voice was gentle. "Margaret, the department needs to know if you're returning next semester. We've held your position long enough." I stared at the skyline through the window, feeling the old ache of chalk dust and lecture halls. "I need another month," I said finally. "I'll decide then." That night, I met Melissa for dinner at a small Italian restaurant near the harbor. Candlelight shimmered on the window between us. "The dean called," I told her. "I might have to choose between teaching and this." She smiled softly. "You already have, Mom." "I'm not a CEO, Melissa. I'm a professor. Maybe you're both," she said. "Maybe Grandma knew it all along." I looked down at the pasta cooling on my plate. "My mother, Eleanor Blackwood, had predicted all of this, hadn't she? The secret shares, the letter, the plan to rebuild with conscience instead of greed. Back home, I unfolded her letter again. One line I'd overlooked before struck like a revelation. The same insight that interprets Shakespeare can illuminate a boardroom. Ethics and art are cousins, both demand truth. I slept that night with the letter beside me, my mother's handwriting etched into my dreams. 3 months after the scandal began, snow blanketed Boston in a hush of renewal. From my office window, I watched cranes lifting steel beams over the frozen harbor, the same project nearly lost to corruption. Alexander had accepted a plea deal: no jail, community service, a heavy fine, and a new mission teaching corporate ethics. Victoria now headed community outreach, turning her social polish toward something genuine. Even Father had begun to change. Our weekly advisory meetings were tense but civil. His arrogance had thinned into wary honesty. One morning, while we reviewed a new procurement policy, he said quietly, "Your mother kept a journal, wrote about you often." I froze. "I didn't know that." "I'll send it over. You should read what she saw in you long before I did." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever hear from him. As winter deepened, the transformation quickened. The board approved our new charter, embedding transparency into the company's foundation. Reporters began calling our turnaround the Blackwood model. For the first time, the name didn't taste bitter on my tongue. We ended that quarter not richer, but cleaner, and that felt like the greater profit. At the holiday gathering that year, I stood in the museum's marble hall watching employees and their families laugh freely for the first time since the scandal. Melissa found me near the Renaissance paintings, a glass of champagne in hand. "You've done something remarkable, Mom," she said. "They're not just relieved. They're proud." "It's still fragile," I cautioned. "But you started it," she smiled. "That's what matters." Across the room, my father raised his glass toward me. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a small, silent acknowledgement between two survivors, and for once I lifted mine back. Spring came to Boston like forgiveness, slow, hesitant, but undeniable. The harbor thawed, gulls returned, and the city's skyline shimmered again in the clean light of renewal. For months, I had lived in constant motion, rebuilding, reforming, proving. But now, with the worst behind us, I could finally breathe. We had survived the scandal, barely. But survival wasn't enough. I wanted redemption. That morning, I stood in the boardroom overlooking the waterfront. The air smelled faintly of salt and new paint. The walls were adorned with community art from the schools we'd funded through the new Harborfront Foundation. The very company that once exploited the city was now pouring resources into rebuilding it. "Everything's approved," Thomas said, placing a folder in front of me. "The foundation's official. You'll chair the board." The city granted the old shipyard site for the community center. A small smile tugged at my lips. "Mother would have liked that. She'd have insisted on it," he replied. Later that day, I visited the shipyard myself. The wooden docks were weathered, the air heavy with the scent of brine and old iron. Standing there, I imagined the laughter of children, where now there was only seagull cries and rust. A voice broke through my thoughts. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" It was Victoria. She was dressed in soft beige, her hair pulled back, no longer the sharp-edged socialite I'd once known. "It's honest," I said, gazing across the water. "Hard work happened here." She nodded. "I was thinking the same. My team's working on the design. We want it to feel open, like a promise." For a moment, the wind lifted her scarf, and I saw the sincerity in her eyes. "I'm proud of you," I said quietly. She laughed, surprised. "Proud of me?" "I meant it," I said. "You faced the truth. You changed." Her eyes softened. "You changed, Mead." We stood there in silence, two women bound by the same bloodline and broken legacy, watching the sea reclaim the light. That evening, Melissa came over to my townhouse. The house still smelled faintly of cedar and old books, my mother's touch lingering in every corner. We sat by the fireplace, the room bathed in amber glow. "Grandpa called," she said, tucking her legs under her on the couch. "He asked if I'd help digitize Grandma's old journals." I blinked. "He actually offered that?" She nodded. "He said he wants them preserved before memory gets careless." I smiled. That sounds exactly like him. Then she reached into her bag and handed me a small leather-bound book. "He told me to give you this first. Said it was your mother's last journal. The one she never showed anyone." My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The first page carried her neat handwriting, still graceful after all these years. Margaret will always choose truth over comfort. I pray the world won't punish her for it. I felt my throat tighten. Page after page, I read about the things I never knew she saw. Her worries about Father's growing ambition, her quiet hopes for me, her belief that I could build something better from the wreckage she foresaw. And at the very end, a line written in darker ink, as if pressed with urgency. When the time comes, remember that rebuilding isn't about power. It's about love made visible. I closed the book and held it to my chest. Melissa watched me, eyes full of tenderness. She'd be proud of you, Mom. I'm not sure pride is the word, I said softly. Maybe relief. A few weeks later, we broke ground for the Eleanor Blackwood Community Center. Reporters gathered, cameras flashing, the wind lifting the edges of the blue ribbons strung across the old dock. Alexander stood beside me, thinner, humbled, but steadier. I never thought I'd see this day, he murmured. Neither did I admitted. When I took the podium, I spoke without notes. My mother believed that privilege means responsibility. This land once built ships, now it will build lives. May this place stand as proof that redemption isn't about forgetting what we did, but doing something better because of it. Applause rippled across the crowd. I caught sight of my father in the front row, hands clasped, eyes lowered. For the first time, he looked not powerful but human. After the ceremony, he approached me quietly. She'd have approved, he said, voice barely audible above the sea breeze. She'd have expected it. I corrected, smiling faintly. He gave a short, rough laugh. She always did. For a long moment we stood side by side, the wind tugging at our coats, the water glimmering beneath a pale sun. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of his shadow, only the shared memory of the woman who had shaped us both. That night, I returned home exhausted but peaceful. I placed my mother's journal on the mantel beside her portrait, the one where she stood in her garden, sunlight caught in her silver hair. I poured a glass of wine, sat by the fire, and listened to the city outside. No longer angry, no longer judging, just alive. In the reflection of the window, I saw myself older, perhaps a little worn, but steady. My face no longer carried guilt, only purpose. The phone rang. It was the dean again. Margaret, the board agreed to extend your sabbatical another year. But if you decide to come back, your classroom is waiting. I smiled. Thank you. But for now, I think my lessons belong somewhere else. After I hung up, I opened my laptop and typed the first entry of the Foundation's public mission statement: to transform legacy into light. To teach that wealth is not a fortress, but a bridge. When I pressed save, I felt something settle inside me. The same peace my mother must have felt when she wrote her last words. Outside, the harbor lights flickered like stars, and somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, faint but sure. The past no longer felt like an anchor. It was a compass. And for the first time I knew exactly where I was going. Autumn crept back into Boston with quiet grace. The leaves blushed crimson and gold, the harbor softened to glass in the late afternoon light, and every evening carried that faint scent of wood smoke and salt that always reminded me of my mother. It had been a year since the scandal broke, a year since the letter changed everything. And yet some days, it still felt like yesterday. The community center was nearly finished. Workers were planting trees along the courtyard, children's murals were already brightening the walls, and I spent most days there, helping, overseeing, or simply walking through its empty halls, feeling the ghosts of the past turn into echoes of hope. It was a Thursday when my father called. His voice, though older, still carried that steady command that once defined every dinner table, every boardroom, every word he spoke. "Margaret," he said, pausing, "I'd like to see you alone." I hesitated. Months of tentative peace had passed between us. Polite phone calls, brief updates, occasional shared appearances for the press, but we hadn't truly spoken since the day I confronted him. "Of course," I said finally. "When?" "This afternoon," he replied. "At the house." The house. I hadn't stepped inside the Blackwood estate since that night. The night of the gala, the night everything began to unravel. When I arrived, the iron gates were half open, the gardens a little overgrown, ivy curling along the marble pillars like time reclaiming pride. Inside, the air smelled of cedar polish and fading perfume, my mother's favorite scent somehow still lingering. He was waiting in the study, the same room where he once lectured me about family image and public duty. But now the fire was low, his posture bent, his face lined not by arrogance but wariness. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. I nodded. "You sounded serious." He gestured toward the chair opposite his. "Sit, please." I sat, my pulse steady but cautious. He poured 2 glasses of scotch, slid one toward me, then didn't touch his own. "I've been reviewing the numbers. The company's stable again, profitable even. Under your leadership." I didn't respond. "I also saw the press release for the Foundation's first scholarship." He continued. "You named it after your mother. She earned it," I said simply. He nodded. "Yes, she did." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then he leaned back, eyes distant. "I was wrong about her, you know. About you. About everything." I looked up, startled. He gave a soft, broken laugh. "When you spend your life building empires, you start believing they're eternal. That the rules don't apply to you, but then your wife keeps receipts." Despite myself, I smiled faintly. "She always did." His voice grew softer. "Eleanor was the conscience of this family, and I silenced her. I told myself I was protecting her, but really I was protecting myself." He turned toward the window, the light catching the edges of his silver hair. "I've spent months thinking about what legacy means. I thought it was what you leave behind, but it's really what you change while you're still here." I said nothing, afraid my voice might betray the emotion tightening my chest. He reached for a folder on the desk, slid it across to me. "I've drafted something. I'd like your approval before I make it official." Inside was a document transferring his remaining shares, the ones he'd fought to keep, into the Harborfront Foundation. A handwritten note was clipped to the top for Eleanor, for Margaret. For the truth I was too proud to see. My throat closed. "You don't have to." "I do," he interrupted softly. "It's the only thing that feels right." Silence filled the room, heavy but peaceful. I reached out, placed my hand over his. For the first time in my life I saw him not as a figure of control, but as a man trying, finally, to make amends. "Thank you," I whispered. He smiled, small, tired, but genuine. "You were always more like her than I admitted." We talked for hours after that. About my mother, about the company, about the years wasted on pride. He asked about Melissa's classes, about the foundation, about my lectures. For once, our conversation didn't feel like a negotiation. It felt like family. When I stood to leave, he rose too, slower than before. "Margaret." "Les." He hesitated. "You were right to expose it all. I thought I'd hate you for it. But I don't. You saved what was worth saving." I felt my eyes sting. "I just followed her lead." He gave a faint nod. "Then she taught you well." As I drove away, the estate disappeared in the rearview mirror, its white columns fading into the gold of the trees, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I was carrying it forward. That evening, Melissa met me at the community center. She was holding a box of art supplies and a grin that looked so much like my mother's. "Ready for tomorrow?" she asked. "The grand opening." I smiled. "More than ready." The next day, the center filled with people. Families, workers, students, journalists. Lauder replaced the echoes of shipyard hammers. The mayor spoke. Victoria unveiled the sculpture she'd designed. A pair of hands holding light. And I stepped up to the microphone for the final speech. "When this began," I said, looking out over the crowd, "I thought justice meant punishment. But it doesn't. Justice means transformation. It means turning silence into truth, guilt into growth, legacy into love." My mother believed that wealth has no value unless it serves others. Today, we honor that belief. Applause thundered through the hall. Somewhere in the front row, my father wiped his eyes. As the music swelled and the ribbon fell, sunlight streamed through the glass dome, scattering across faces smiling, tearful, alive. Later, when the crowd dispersed, I walked outside. The harbor gleamed in the late afternoon light, the waves whispering against the dock. I thought of my mother's letter, of her faith in me, of the woman she hoped I'd become. Melissa joined me, slipping her hand into mine. "Grandma would be proud," she said softly. I smiled, watching the horizon. "I think she already knows." For a long while, we stood there, 3 generations bound by love, truth, and the courage to change what was broken. When the sun dipped below the waterline, I turned toward the city, its lights flickering awake. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better. And that, I realized, was enough. I whispered into the breeze, almost to myself, "We did it, Mother." And for the first time in my life, I felt her answer, not in words, but in the calm certainty of peace. If you believe truth can rebuild even the most broken legacy, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Every story deserves a reckoning, and every reckoning deserves a voice.